Any questions about any of the stuff we've been working on so far? Like, for example, last homework. Last homework assignment had to do with that traditional square of oppositions and the sorts of immediate inferences that I can make from all of the relationships between A, E, I, and O statements. Any questions there? Yes?
This is just kind of like, I don't know, like, could you maybe give us another worksheet on that? I have a hard time deciphering if they're valid or not.
If the inferences are valid?
Right.
So the inferences are going to be valid, and so like in addition to the worksheet and the homework, like more exercises on that? Send me an email, and I might be able to come up with some more for you. See if I can remember, like, there might be some ways that you can kind of generate more for yourself. Also, oh, nope, you can't go to the book because the square of oppositions isn't in the book. So yeah, send me an email, and I'll put something together, and I'll probably post it on Canvas for everybody as well. But if you are having trouble trying to figure out like whether or not those immediate inferences are valid, just know if it follows the rule, like, well, identify like what is the relationship that's supposed to exist between these two kinds of statements. For example, if it was an A and an E statement, an A statement and its corresponding E statement, so like all A's are B's, and then if we said like all A's are B's is true, therefore no A's are B's is true? No, let's make it false. That seems more plausible. All A's are B's is true, therefore no A's are B's is false. That's an A statement and an E statement, right? What's the relationship supposed to be between an A and an E statement? What do we call that relationship? Those are contraries. And the rule for contraries is?
That they both can't be true.
They can't both be true. Yeah. Slight difference in the wording there. Yeah, it's not they both can't be true. They both can't be true means that they both have to be false, right? They both can't be true? No, it's that they can't both be true. Only one of them at most could be true. At least one of them has to be false, is another way of saying this. So if the A statement is true and they can't both be true, the E statement would have to be false. That's what the argument was saying, right? It was going from a true A to therefore a false E. And so that would be valid. If I tried to go from a false A to a true E, that one wouldn't work because it wouldn't follow that rule of they can't both be true at the same time. So, all right, so we've talked about that. We've talked about, well, we started out, and hopefully, has everybody like got this down already? We started out just identifying A, E, I, and O statements. Do we have that like down? That's in your back pocket, right? You don't even have to sweat to figure out whether you're looking at an A statement, an E statement, an I statement, or an O statement. If you are still having trouble with it, things might get a little difficult today. Because like what we're building today is assuming that you've got this down pat already. So here's an opportunity to keep practicing it. We also, at our last meeting, we were just talking about this, talked about the traditional square of oppositions and the sorts of immediate inferences that I might make. And with by immediate inference, all we really mean here is that it's one premise directly to one conclusion, no other premises. Today we're going to start to look at more sophisticated arguments, arguments with more than one premise. We're going to start talking about categorical syllogisms. Syllogism is an old Greek word. It just means, well, actually, literally, it means, like nowadays, it means exactly two premises and one conclusion. A deductive argument with exactly two premises that gets us to one conclusion. And we're going to see that there's some other stuff that we can say about it, too. It's got a certain sort of a structure to it. Every categorical syllogism has that structure. The etymology of the word just means some things that are thought together, syllogismos, right, or spoken together, depending on what you think logos means. And we can think of this is how an argument works, right? If I think or I speak the premises, if it's valid, I'm also going to have to think or speak the conclusion as well, things that are spoken or thought together. That's what a syllogism is. So a deductive argument consisting of two premises and exactly one conclusion, like, for example, let's back that up just a little bit. All soldiers are patriots. No traitors are patriots. Therefore, no traitors are soldiers. What do you think? On first glance, does that look like a valid argument? And does this seem like the sort of thing that, like, I don't know, what do you think? Could you figure this out just by thinking about it? It is set up a little bit funny? We're going to find out today because we're going to develop a method to determine whether or not any categorical syllogism is valid or invalid. It's not the fanciest of methods. It's not the most exciting of methods, but it's the first one that we're going to learn. There's a whole bunch of stuff on the worksheet that I've passed out that is going to kind of like act as a cheat sheet for you as you're getting started. And the first thing that I want to talk about with any sort of categorical syllogism, because the method that we're going to be developing today won't work at all unless we do this first, is to try to determine if that syllogism is in the right form. There are a couple of things that I want to maintain to make sure that any categorical syllogism is in what we're going to call the standard form for a categorical syllogism. And the first of those is I want to make sure that my conclusion is actually coming last. That's pretty obvious. Make sure that my conclusion comes third, and I'm going to have two other premises before that. Once I figure out what my conclusion is, in this case it wasn't very difficult, there's a big fat therefore in it, and my sense is we're all pros at identifying the conclusion of an argument by now. Is that right? All right. So once you've identified the conclusion, note that there's going to be some sort of subject term and there's going to be some sort of predicate term in that conclusion. There's a subject term and a predicate term in all of these statements because they're all categorical propositions. There's always going to be some quantifier, subject, copula, predicate. So my conclusion has a subject and it has a predicate. I want to draw our attention to the predicate first. This predicate of the conclusion, whatever the rest of the argument is doing, I'll look at the conclusion and the predicate term, that is what is known as my major term. Good on that so far? My major term needs to occur in one of my premises. In addition to the conclusion, it's got to pop up in the premise. There's no way this argument's going to work if the predicate of my conclusion isn't also somewhere in my premises. Otherwise, I'll just be pulling that predicate out of thin air, and that's not how a valid argument is supposed to work. So it's going to occur as the predicate of my conclusion, and it's also going to occur in one of my premises. The premise where my major term occurs is called the major premise. That's why we call it the major premise, because it's got the major term. Good so far? Major term is in my major premise. The subject term in my conclusion is not the major term, it's the, any guesses? It's a minor term, yeah. The minor term is always the subject of my conclusion, and it's also going to occur in one of the premises. It is always going to occur in a different premise than the major premise. It's going to occur in the minor premise. And this is how any categorical syllogism is going to work. I'll have one premise that has my major term, another premise that has my minor term, and then I'm going to have some third term that's in each of those premises, but it doesn't occur in the conclusion at all, called the middle term. The middle term, all that it does is it links the major term to the minor term so that I can put them together in the conclusion. So they're going to come separately in the premises. Major term's going to be in one premise. Minor term's going to be in another premise. They're both going to be related to a middle term, and that's going to allow me to put them together in my conclusion. Cool so far? That's a categorical syllogism. And if my categorical syllogism is in standard form, it's going to look exactly like this. Conclusion comes third. My major premise is going to have to come first. And my minor premise is going to have to come second. And when I mention this, note that like if I just swapped those two statements, if I just said like, let's make this one come first and that one come second, the argument would still make it like it would still make sense, right? The argument would you would still be able to read it and figure out what it was trying to say, but it wouldn't be in standard form. It's important that it be in standard form because the strategy that we're going to learn today requires that like the order in which these premises come, it matters for like actually pulling off this strategy. So are we good so far on this? We know how to identify our major term. We know how to identify our minor term. We know how to identify our major premise and minor premise. We know how to tell whether or not the argument's in standard form. Let's run through it just to make sure. How can I tell which term is my major term? It's the predicate of the conclusion, yeah. How do I know which one's the minor term? It's the subject of the conclusion. How do I know which premise is my major premise? It's the one that has my major term, or the predicate of the conclusion, right? So the premise that has the same term as the predicate of my conclusion, that's my major premise. And in standard form, my major premise has to come first. Yeah, my minor premise is going to come second, and then my conclusion is going to come third. Okay. If we've got, yes?
Are there any variables that, or letters that are substituted for these that are common? Like, does the premise have a letter?
Yes, in fact, and we'll get to, it would be nice perhaps to, I was realizing this in the last session, it would be nice to kind of like take one slide out at least to talk about that. Because if you were going to try to represent the major term with just one letter to make it simpler so that you could see the structure, the minor term with just one letter, it might be tempting to be like, oh, major term, I'll make it M for major, and minor term, I'll make it M for minor, and middle term, I'll make it M for middle. Nah, it's not going to work at all, right? We have to make them all different letters so that I can tell them apart. So usually the convention on this is S for the subject of the conclusion, so my minor term is going to be S, my major term is going to be P for the predicate of the conclusion, and my middle term is going to be M for middle term. We'll see that as like we do more of these examples. Where we need to be right now is we understand how to identify our major term, our minor term. We know that the major term occurs in the major premise and that the major premise has to come first in order for this to be in standard form. And it seems like we're all on board with this, so advance to the next slide. The strategy that we're going to be employing to determine whether or not a categorical syllogism is valid requires that we determine what the mood and figure of my argument is. And these are two separate issues that combined, if I can tell like what the mood of the syllogism is and I can tell what the figure is, I can figure out exactly what its unique structural form is. And this is where the validity of the argument is going to lie. It's any deductive argument, its validity is going to lie in its structural form, not on its content. So we need to look at mood and what determining mood involves. We need to look at figure and determine what determining figure involves. And if we have both of those together, I'm going to be able to figure out whether or not this argument is valid or invalid. Let's start with mood. The mood of a categorical syllogism is just what kinds of statements are involved. Like what kind of statement is my major premise, what kind of statement is my minor premise, what kind of statement is my conclusion. This argument, all soldiers are patriots, no traitors are patriots, therefore no traitors are soldiers, is an AEE argument, or an AEE syllogism. The mood is AEE. And I call it an AEE because my first premise is an A statement, all soldiers are patriots. My second premise is an E statement, no traitors are patriots. And my conclusion is an E statement, no traitors are soldiers. Does that make sense? This is the part where like you got to be able to like, if you get hung up on this, it's going to slow you down. It's going to make the rest of this very, very difficult. You should be able to spot at a glance. That's an A, that's an E, that's an E. And notice whether or not this is in standard form matters. Because if I swapped those two around, if my minor premise came before my major premise, instead of the mood being AEE, I'd think that the mood was EAE. And so like we can see like immediately it matters what order these statements come in. I got to have my major premise first, my minor premise second, and my conclusion third. Otherwise, the mood's going to be all over the place, right? So mood, AEE. Figure. Figure doesn't have to do with what kinds of statements we're talking about. It has to do with where the relative positions of the major, minor, and middle terms are in all of these statements. In the conclusion, the major term and the minor term are always going to be in the same place, right? Because this is how we defined major and minor term. P, my major term, is always going to be the predicate of my conclusion. S, my minor term, always going to be the subject of my conclusion. So there's no variation there. But my middle term could be the subject of one of my premises, or it could be the predicate of one of my premises. And the fact that I can vary that, the fact that my middle term could be in the subject or the predicate position in the major premise, or it could be in the subject or the predicate position in my minor premise. This gives me a whole bunch of different possibilities for how I can arrange these terms, right? So the way that we usually talk about this is the figure is all about the location of the middle term. In figure 1, the middle term is the subject in the major premise and it's the predicate in the minor premise. It comes first and then second. In figure 2, it comes second both times. In figure 3, it comes first both times. And in figure 4, it comes second. It's the predicate in my major premise, and it's the subject in my minor premise. There are all kinds of wacky mnemonic devices to try to remember which figure goes with like where the middle terms are. I gotta be honest, I don't think I've ever come across one that was really compelling and useful. The closest that I've heard is like to think of it like a shirt collar. I think that might even be what like your book says, like do the shirt collar method, because this supposedly looks a little bit like a shirt collar. I don't know, I don't see it. Another way to do it is to like keep this chart with you. It's on the back of your worksheet, for example, until you've done it enough times that it just kind of clicks for you. So, figure is all about where the middle term is. And there are 4 different possibilities, because the middle term could be subject or predicate in the major premise, or it could be subject or predicate in the minor premise. Middle term is never going to occur in my conclusion, so the conclusion doesn't matter when I'm talking about the figure. All soldiers are patriots. No traitors are patriots. Therefore, no traitors are soldiers. We determined just a second ago that this was in standard form. There's my major term. There it is in the first premise. There's my minor term. There it is in the second premise. Good. What was the mood again? A, E, E. What's the figure of this argument? 2. How do you figure that the figure is 2? Patriots, yeah. Patriots is my middle term, right? Patriots is the term that comes up in both of the premises, but it doesn't appear in the conclusion at all. It's my middle term, and it's the predicate in both premises. That is, bing, figure 2. Does this chart make sense to everybody? We have a subject position, we have a predicate position for our major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. And we're just tracking where the middle terms occur in this. So yeah, there's my middle term. The mood was AEE. The figure is 2. The mood and figure together for this argument, and any argument that has the same structure, is AEE2. That's the mood, how I would represent the mood and figure. Want to try it with a new argument? What is the mood and figure for this syllogism? Step 1. What is step 1? Major and minor premise. Yeah, I want to figure out if this is in standard form first, right? Before I even get into mood, what are my major and minor terms? What's my major term in this argument? Lapdogs. If you're not sure, or if you're hearing like, how did they figure that out, that it was lapdogs? Anybody who does think that it's lapdogs, why? Why is lapdogs the major term? Well, I could just as easily swap the first and second premise, and the argument would still... There you go. It's the predicate of the conclusion. So yeah, predicate of the conclusion, that's my major term. And now I see, it's in the first premise, so that's good. I want my major term in my first premise. My minor term is sporting dogs. There it is in my minor premise. Good, so this is in standard form. I've got major premise, minor premise, conclusion. And my middle term is hounds. Whoop. What's the mood? E-I-O, and we can figure that out because it's an E statement, an I statement, and an O statement. And I have to put it in standard form first. I have to make sure, because if this wasn't in standard form, if I had swapped the first 2 premises, I wouldn't be able to notice right off the bat. And instead of E-I-O, I would have said the mood was I-E-O. So the mood is E-I-O, and what's the figure? 1. This is E-I-O 1. Bing! Shall we try it one more time? Let's try it one more time. All quasars are supernovas. This is because all supernovas are objects that emit massive amounts of energy, and all quasars are objects that emit massive amounts of energy. Is that in standard form? No. Right off the bat, I can tell it's not in standard form because my conclusion actually comes first, right? This is one of those wacky times that the conclusion is right up front, and then I say, this is because blackety blah, blah, blah. So all quasars are supernovas. That should be my conclusion, which means, what's my major term? Supernovas. My minor term is quasars. So the premise that's about supernovas, it's because all supernovas are objects, that needs to be the one that comes first. And the one about quasars, that needs to be the one that comes second. And then my conclusion is going to come third. That's what that looks like when we sort it all out. What's the mood? AAA. All blanks are blank. All blanks are blank. All blanks are blank. Mood is AAA. Get me there. Come on. And the figure is 2, apparently. Do we see how this works? AAA because it's an all blanks are blank, all blanks are blank, all blanks are blank. That's the mood. And the figure is 2 because my middle term, objects that emit massive amounts of energy, that comes second in my first premise, and it comes second in my second premise. It's in the predicate position both times. If I look that up on my chart, my figure chart, which I don't have apparently, which means somebody might have a one-sided worksheet out there. If I look that up on my figure chart, that is figure 2, right? That's totally figure 2. So this is AAA2. How are we feeling about determining mood and figure? You get some practice, so yeah, no sweat. Maybe the real question that's banging around here is, so who gives a shit, like, that I know the mood and figure? What do I do with that information? Well, here's what I do with that information. I recognize perhaps that, because I can have 4 different possible letters for my major premise could be an A, E, I, or an O statement. My minor premise could be an A, E, I, or an O statement. My conclusion could be an A, E, I, or an O statement. And I have 4 different figures that those 3 statements could take, depending on where the middle term's occurring. If I sat down and worked out all the different combinations and permutations therein, I might come to the conclusion that there are, in fact, 256 different possible syllogistic forms. And as it turns out, only a handful of them are actually valid. And some lovely medieval monks, a long, long time ago, went and figured out for us which ones are valid and which ones are not, and they put it all on a chart just like this. So if you know what the mood and figure is, you can look up the mood and figure on this chart and determine whether or not the argument is valid. This is an incredibly dumb way to do this, but it's the first way that we'll do it. The next way that we'll do it is a little harder, but it's the sort of thing that you don't need to carry around a card in your pocket all the time to look this up on a chart. Yes?
But isn't AAA2 invalid because it's not on the chart?
That's exactly right. So yeah, an argument that is mood AAA and figure 2, we'll notice, figure 2, is there an AAA? Nope. Also note here that this chart is divided into 2 different sections. We have 15 of what are known as unconditionally valid syllogisms, and then we have 9 of these what we're calling conditionally valid syllogisms. Did I say that right the first time? Unconditionally ones up here. You can read it just as well as I can. The 15 unconditionally valid ones are on top. There are 9 additional conditionally valid syllogisms. We're not even going to get into the difference between unconditional and conditional validity today. That'll pop up next week. But just for now, kind of put a little pin in this and say oh yeah, there's supposedly a difference. And we'll talk later about what that difference is. It has to do with this question of whether or not the things that we're talking about actually exist. So some of these, it doesn't matter if they exist. The syllogism will still work just fine. Some of these, it does matter if the terms that I'm talking about actually do exist. And we'll get into that when we start looking at other methods. For now, just know that I look up whatever the figure is, and I see if the mood is located there. And if it's not there, that means that argument was invalid. So the AAA2, what was it? That was the one about the quasars and supernovas? That argument is not valid. And if anybody was like, how do you know that? I'd be like, here's the mood and figure, and here's the chart that the medieval monks worked out for us. And it's not on the chart. Now some of you might be thinking to yourself, but should I believe the chart? I don't know if I trust medieval monks. They've said all kinds of wacky shit all throughout the years. Yeah, maybe you should be skeptical, in which case, hang around for Monday, because we'll find another method that we could use to prove this chart. But for now, let's just keep the chart. It's going to be a handy tool for us. We're going to be able to use it to check our work with other methods as well. So, AEE2, all soldiers are patriots, no traitors are patriots, therefore no traitors are soldiers. What do you think? Is that valid or invalid? Valid? How do you figure? Is it on the chart? AEE2. It is, bing, there it is. Unconditionally valid. That first argument was valid. What about this one? The ones about hounds and lapdogs and sporting dogs. That was an EIO1 argument. Is that valid?
Yes.
It is valid. Let's look it up. EIO1. There it is. Yep, EIO1. Good. What about that last one? AAA2? We said that one it's not valid because it doesn't appear anywhere on this chart that has all of the valid categorical syllogisms. Get how that works? Cool. We have a worksheet that has the first 3 questions are starting us off with arguments, asking you to make sure that it's in standard form, then asking you to tell me what the mood and figure is, and then use that mood and figure to tell whether or not the argument is valid. That's the first 3. The second 3 questions actually ask you to do this process backwards, which I haven't showed you how to do yet, but it's not that hard. I'll show you how to do it right now. So for example, let's take a look at, I think it's question number, it's 1 on the second part on your worksheet that says, starts you off with an AAE3 argument and then asks for its form and to tell whether it's valid or not. The validity part is easy peasy, right? AAE3, is that valid? You just look it up on the chart. Is AAE3 valid? Nope, doesn't appear to be, right? So yeah, it's not valid, but the question is like, what does its expanded form look like? I'll start out by doing it thusly. AAE3 is going to have, in standard form, an A statement, and then an E statement. I don't know where my major, minor, or middle terms are going to be occurring here, but I do know that the first premise is going to be all blanks are blank. The second premise is going to be all blanks are blank because it's an A, E, and then because it's E, my conclusion is going to be no blanks are blank. That makes sense? Now I just have to try to figure out like where all the other pieces go, where my major, minor, and middle terms go. Because this is figure 3, I know exactly where my middle terms go. Where do my middle terms go? Left side, also known as the subject, right? Subject of both premises should be my middle term. There it goes. Subject of both premises is the middle term. And now where do my minor and major terms go? Major one's got to be in the first premise. And also where else? And the predicate of my conclusion. So yeah, and then my minor term is going to be in the second premise and the subject. Bink, bink, bink of the conclusion. That's the expanded form of an AAE3 syllogism. Incidentally, by the way, if, for example, we had somebody who was saying to themselves, yeah, the worksheet and the homework assignment that you gave me weren't enough practice. I want more practice on something like this. You can make up, like just pick 3 letters, as long as they're all A, E, I, and O, right? Just pick 3 letters at random. What do you think? A, E, I, O. Pick one. O? E? Wesley? A? O, E, A. And a number? Regina? 1? O, E, A, 1. There, you just made a homework assignment for yourself, right? O, A, E, 1. Is it valid? What should it look like? I can do it like that, right? And then once I get that argument, I can then kind of work back as well. Make up my own homework assignments. Yeah, Amin. The middle term is the term that does not occur in the conclusion at all, and it occurs in each of the premises once. So yeah, it's the term that's in both of the premises, but it's not in the conclusion. That's your middle term.
What about like numbers?
What about what now? Oh, so like what do you do with the number, the figure part, right? So I know that the figure on AAE3 is 3 because the 3. Yeah. So I just need to know like where's the middle term in figure 3. On your worksheet, there on the back of the worksheet, there's a little cheat sheet that has that chart that shows you where all the middle terms go. Yeah, got that. That's how you do it. Questions about how to do these? Okay, let's take some time to work on the worksheet by ourselves / with our immediate neighbors. We'll check back in as a class on the sideboard and see if we've all got this figured out and we're ready to go home for the weekend and just do the homework assignment.